3, 2, 1.
Welcome, everyone, to Alaska Quarterly Review's Pieces de Resistance Reading and Conversation series. I am Ronald Spatz, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review. Today's event is titled Facts into Poems and features a conversation between poets Jane Hirshfield and Dorianne Laux, two of America's most esteemed poets and longtime contributing editors to Alaska Quarterly Review. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel for future viewing, youtube.com/Alaska Quarterly Review. Although our events are always free of charge, these are really hard times for literary magazines, and tax-exempt donations to support Alaska Quarterly Review are welcome on our website, aqreview.org. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgements. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and Web 907 for its web support, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. We also thank the 49 Writers Organization for sharing information about this event. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional present and future caretakers of this land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement toward decolonization and equity. Jane Hirshfield, writing some of the most important poetry in the world today, according to Naomi Shihab Nye description in the New York Times, is one of America's poetry central spokespersons for concerns of the biosphere. Founder of Poets for Science, a traveling installation that will actually be here in Alaska at the Pratt Museum down in Homer, starting in April, and a former chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. Hirshfield is the author of 9 collections of poetry, including most recently Ledger, published by Knopf in 2020, The Beauty in 2015, which was long listed for the National Book Award, and Given Sugar, Given Salt 2001, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Other honors include fellowships from the Guggenheim and Rockefeller Foundations and the National Endowment for the Arts. Her work appears in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the New York Times, the Times Literary Supplement of London, Poetry, and in 10 editions of the Best American Poetry. Her work has been translated in over 15 languages. In 2019, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The Washington Post describes Jane Hirshfield as taking her place in the pantheon of modern masters. Celebrated and sought after throughout the years, there is something about a Dorianne Laux poem that will delight and haunt you until the end of days, said poet Ada Limon, writing in the Oprah magazine. Dorianne Laux' 6th collection, Only as the Day is Long, New and Selected Poems, was named a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Her 5th collection, The Book of Men, was awarded the Patterson Prize. Her 4th book of poems, Facts About the Moon, won the Oregon Book Award and was shortlisted for the Lenore Marshall Poetry Prize. Dorianne Laux is also the author of Awake, What We Carry, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, Smoke, as well as a fine small press edition The Book of Women. She is the co-author of the celebrated text, The Poet's Companion, a guide to the pleasures of writing poetry. Dorianne is currently a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. Dorianne Laux has written about love and violence, survival and grief in poems that are clear, compelling, and insightful, wrote Elizabeth Lund in the Washington Post. Dorianne Laux shows us how to endure hardships without losing humanity and compassion. So now I am honored and absolutely excited to turn this event completely over to Jane and Dorianne. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron, and thank you to both the Alaska Quarterly Review and the museum for supporting this conversation and discussion and reading and whatever it is we turn into. So I'd like to, and thank all of you, whoever you are, for coming. We don't have gallery view how we're on, so I can't see your faces, but thank you for being out there, whoever, wherever you are. So I'd like to give you a little backstory about how this event came into being. I got the latest issue of Alaska Quarterly Review and of course opened it and scanned the table of contents and saw, oh, Dorianne's in there. And then I looked at the title and then I looked at the poem and I thought, wow, this is a great poem. Didn't I write something about that same thing? Which indeed I had. So I think our sources were slightly different. My source was an article in the New York Times, and Dorianne said she picked it up from a North Carolina paper. And I had literally, I'd written the poem, I'd set it aside and hadn't thought about it again. And I went back and found it and thought, that's really interesting. You know, we had the same precipitating set of facts, of story, of newspaper article, and we went, you know, pretty different directions with it. The poems aren't like each other, although they certainly converge. And I sent Ron a happy note. I sent Dorianne a note, and I sent Ron a note saying, I love that, you know, you have Dorianne's poem in AQR, great new issue. And gosh, you know, it reminded me that I'd written something about that too. Isn't that funny? And Ron, as an editor does, immediately said, can I see the poem? And so my poem will be appearing in the next issue of AQR. So it would have been better if they were side by side, but we didn't know they could be side by side, even though Dorianne and I are long, dear friends. We had no idea that we had shared this particular subject matter. So then Ron said, because AQR has been doing an extraordinary series of events and multiple readings and conversations, Ron said, why don't you and Dorianne have a conversation about these two poems you wrote? And me being me, I kind of somehow came back with, that's a great idea. What about if we took up the larger question of facts into poems in general? And he liked the idea and Dorianne liked the idea, so here we are. But we're going to start with the two poems that this began with, and so Dorianne will read you hers first.
Thank you, Jane. It's so great to see you. I mean, you do live literally right down the road, but you know what, this is the first time we've seen each other in a little while. But yeah, you're famous for writing poems and putting them aside. And I remember one morning I called Jane and asked her if she had written anything. And she said, nah, I just wrote a little throwaway poem. And I said, well, read it to me. And she said, no, really, it's nothing. And I said, just read it to me. And so she read it to me. And it was her poem, The Groundfall Pear. And I said, Jane, beautiful poem. I love that poem. Can I have that poem? And she said, sure. You know, and so we use that poem as an example in the Poet's Companion in the erotic section, I believe. And so I got an original Jane Hirshfield poem, which went on to be published in a book. And right?
Yes, if you hadn't responded that warmly to it, it probably would have sat in the bottom drawer. And it ended up being one of those lucky poems that rode around on the New York City subway and buses for 6 months in the Poetry in Motion project, which absolutely baffled me that they would want this little natural world,
Yeah.
subtly erotic poem on the subways and buses, but they did. And I think I gave you a copy of that placard. I hope I did.
I think you did. It was hanging over our doorway for many
Right.
years. Yeah, in fact, one of my students right now is memorizing the ground fall pair for class and just loves it, you know, and year after year, because it's in the Poet's Companion and I teach from there, these students fall in love with that poem again and again. So
Well,
anyway,
thank you. On to yours.
we'll move from that to which we just all recently found out how to pronounce, the Thermopylaeum. And so I'll read my poem. It was in the Daily Star, this little article, and the heading of it was Ancient Snack Stall Uncovered in Pompeii. Even in 79 AD, people loved street food. All the young Romans flocking around the sizzling terracotta pots, the stalls frescoed with chickens and hanging ducks, hot drinks served in ceramic two-handled pateras, filled with warm wine and spices. Their sandaled feet glimmered as they milled about, waving hellos, smudging one another's cheeks with kisses, murmuring gossip, complaining about the crazy rise in the price of wheat. Soups and stews, skewered meats, stacks of flatbread, honey cakes, and candy made with figs. They sprawled on the steps or sat near a neighbor's open door, stood under a blur of windows, someone playing a lyre, barefoot children reciting the odes of Horace. Just like New York before the pandemic, before the many retreated and retired to their living rooms to watch the news on a loop, alone with a cat or dog, a furry stay against the nothing, nothing, nothing of loneliness, their dreams a passport to fear. I used to see the excavated people of Pompeii, frozen in time, caught curled in sleep or kneeling, a couple fucking, though there is one of a possible father propped in what looks like an easy chair, a mother bouncing a child on her lap, as if they decided in their final moments to be happy, to go into the afterlife covered in ash, buried alive by joy.
Now that is such a classic Dorianne poem. It is so humanely rich, deep, sensuous, ranging, profound. I adore it. I think mine might still end up in the drawer, but I'm going to have to read it to you because Ron liked it.
Well, it's going to be an AQR, so.
Yeah, exactly. And who knows, maybe it'll be in the next book. I don't know. Haven't have to decide those things yet. Thermopylaeum. Found in an earthenware vessel, remnants of a Pompeian street stand's last day stew. Fish, sheep meat, snails. Perhaps a meal delicious, tender. The archaeologists don't say. A person eats first for the joy of tasting, then for the joy of living to be once again hungry. A person tilts their head when they hear or see something new, as if change of angle could lead to change of seeing. But you eat with your head upright, untilted, directly above your reliable throat, stomach, intestines, legs. Your life that expects to go on. Then something surprises, a recipe or the end of the world as you've known it, and you pause, mouth filled with fish, snails, and sheep meat. You tilt your head to listen, one moment longer. So Dorianne, in her poem, she sees the street, the lives, she brings it into our world. What caught me in the account that I read was that stew and pondering, so in the same bowl, because they can do DNA analysis now of these archaeological residues, this was in fact the recipe. It was a stew made out of fish, sheep, and snails. And I was just totally boggled by what would that taste like? Was it delicious? Was it a popular dish? Was it just what the cook had on hand in the back and sort of threw in and took a gamble on? The great discovery that the archaeological article describes is they didn't even know there were snack stands like this. So Dorianne, maybe talk a little about so for me, I was caught by the implausible recipe. That food is what got to me. And of course, the context of Pompeii. Why don't you talk a little about what pulled you in?
Yeah, well, I've had a long time interest in Pompeii. As a child, I had these books called childcraft books, which were for children. The Encyclopedia of America, I think, or Britannia, I don't know, used to sell them. And we had all the childcraft, and there was one on art. And there was in there a whole thing on, or one on, must have been history or culture or something, but Pompeii. And I would just sit and stare at those pictures for hours and imagine what it would be like to have been alive then and look at those people frozen in time. And I don't think I knew it then, but I think I was drawn to that because they were what I might have thought of if I'd known to as poems, moments frozen in time, pulled out of their context. The narrative is behind them, in front of them, but it's just the moment. And so whenever I hear anything about Pompeii, I'm immediately interested. And then to find out they had snack stalls, and it just amazed me. And I thought, that is such a wonderful thing to think of them milling about just like we do, when we go to a little street fair or, a park that, has all these little booths. And I thought, yeah, they're not so different from us. They probably enjoyed that too, and that's sort of what got me going, was just imagining the joy of being, with the community and the kids and the dogs and the parents and the grandparents and the cousins, everybody together, all surrounding the food, And what I loved about yours was that it focused on the food, which I mention it, but you really, and what's hilarious to me is that you're a vegetarian. Okay, I'm thinking Jane is describing the stew so deliciously and she doesn't eat it, but also your whole little thing before you began, where you said, was it just what the cook had on hand? Was this a recipe? Well, for those of you who might not know, Jane was a cook for many years at Green's, right, in San Francisco. And so, of course, she's thinking like a cook, too, and thinking, oh, well, how did this recipe come about? And knowing that at Green's, probably many times you had a bunch of kale left over you had to use. So that went in the potato leek soup along with the leek. And so it's no wonder to me that it ended up focusing on food, but it's a complete wonder that it was meat dish rather than vegetarian.
Well, I've been very proud of myself anytime I get a meat reference into my work, because after all, our work needs to be larger than our lives, not confined by them. And there is something about the realities of it. So, I have some other poem, I can't even remember which one it is, in which I've got a pig being butchered, which I wrote after a conversation at somebody's house with a man who was a chef at, a full omnivore restaurant.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And he talked about, how he had brought over an Italian traditional butcher to teach them how to, turn their pigs into proper meat cuts for their restaurant. And, many things are fascinating that I hope never to participate in, like the end of the world. May we not witness a Pompeian ending. It is still possible. All of our lives, it has been possible. This moment, it is possible. So your poems must go fearlessly where we ourselves, may not completely willingly go, but that's the work of the imagination, isn't it?
Well, and I love the end of that poem because there's this something that catches the attention, and it's a sound. And of course, we off screen, we readers, we know what that sound probably is. It's the volcano erupting, right? But that person in the poem doesn't know. And so the tension between the reader and the character in the poem is heightened to the absolute extent of the climax of the poem, which doesn't happen. It all appears again off screen. It's only after the poem is over that the big event happens.
Yeah. Well, that's, there's that line in it, penultimate stanza is a one-line stanza, your life that expects to go on. And I think, for both of us, for everyone, that's what's so moving about Pompeii, is everybody expected their life to go on. Everybody was caught in medias res with no idea. And, that's true for any of us at any moment. And you and I did make a parallel response to that, which is both our poems are about the joy of living.
Yes, I noticed that too, that yours is the joy of food. And I love how you say, we eat for the joy of tasting and the joy of living, to eat again. And I thought, these aren't so different. They're both about joy. It's just one's about food and one's about
the whole world.
Community, family. I mean, but they're both saturated in joy, and that is the most important thing, to have in any moment of your life, whether it's the first or the last. I mean, and I, even if the Pompeians had known that this was going to happen, they certainly didn't know they would be, preserved for the rest of time. Their actual bodies would be preserved and displayed for, years and years beyond their deaths, which, I mean, I think of all the possible ways to die. I mean, because it's very quick, you're just boom, and, to be, when you think about that, you think, well, I don't want to be preserved in a moment of anger right? I mean, I want to be preserved doing something that I love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'd love to be preserved with my pen in my hand, writing a poem,
Oh, yes.
Wouldn't that be great? Yeah.
Or W.S. Merwin's wonderful little poem that I can't quote by heart about on the last day of the world, I would like to plant a tree. So before we, I'd like to talk a little about process and facts and poems in a more general way. But before we do, I would love to hear you read Facts About the Moon, the archetypal fact poem.
Yeah. I'm just amazed and delighted by facts. I love facts. And so I have a number of poems that deal with facts. But this particular poem, I really was fascinated with all the facts I learned about the moon on the Discovery Channel. I mean, just watching some, Discovery Channel show. And I literally almost ran, just so I could keep all the things that I had learned in my head. And then, of course, it became something I wanted everybody else to learn, So all the facts in this poem are true facts that I learned on the History Channel. Facts about the moon. The moon is backing away from us 1.5 inches each year. That means if you're like me and were born around 50 years ago, the moon was a full 6 feet closer to the earth. What's a person supposed to do? I feel the gray cloud of consternation travel across my face. I begin thinking about the moonlit past, how if you go back far enough, you can imagine the breathtaking hugeness of the moon. Prehistoric solar eclipses, when the moon covered the sun so completely, there was no corona, only a darkness we had no word for. And future eclipses will look like this: the moon, a small black pupil in the eye of the sun. But these are bald facts. What bothers me most is that someday the moon will spiral right out of orbit and all land-based life will die. The moon keeps the oceans from swallowing the shores, keeps the electromagnetic fields in check at the polar ends of the earth. And please don't tell me what I already know, that it won't happen for a long time. I don't care. I'm afraid of what will happen to the moon. Forget us. We don't deserve the moon. Maybe we once did, but not now, after all we've done. These nights, I harbor a secret pity for the moon, rolling around alone in space without her milky planet, her only child, a mother who's lost a child, a bad child, a greedy child, or maybe a grown boy who's murdered and raped. A mother can't help it. She loves that boy anyway. And in spite of herself, she misses him. And if you sit beside her on the padded hospital bench outside the door to his room, you can't not take her hand. Listen to her while she weeps, telling you how sweet he was, how blue his eyes. And you know she's only romanticizing, that she's conveniently forgotten the bruises and booze, the stolen car, the day he ripped the bones from the walls. And you want to slap her back to sanity, remind her of the truth. He was a leech, a fuck up, a little shit. And you almost do, until she lifts her pale, puffy face, her eyes 2 craters, and then you can't help it either. You know love when you see it. You can feel its lunar strength, its brutal pull.
Just, that has been one of my favorite of your poems since the first time I read it. It's just so astonishing. And, you know, I think, so I love that you attribute it to, you said once Discovery, once History Channel. I don't know which channel you were watching, but yeah,
one of those. Yeah.
One or the other. And it reminded me of Kay Ryan once saying on some onstage interview that all of her natural history facts came from watching television specials. All of my natural history facts come from reading other people's poems. That's a bit of an exaggeration, and more so now than it used to be. But I remember, you know, years ago, many years ago, 1986 or something, I wrote a poem in which there's a line where I correct, the poem says fox, and I say, no, not fox, vixen, because I had seen it squat to pee. And the reason that I knew that female foxes squat to pee, which, you know, one could really know just with a little thought, but I knew it because I had come across that in a William Matthews poem. And so it had struck me particularly. So you know, we get our facts where we can. We get them sometimes directly. We get them sometimes from sources. So I think, you know, I'm gonna read one more poem from a very specific source, and then we can start wandering a little more widely, I think. So this poem is as yet unpublished. It's in the long queue for Scientific American, where they have begun publishing poems, but when it was taken, I was sort of asked, do you have any deadline? We're taking a few. I was asked for a poem and didn't send one for a long time. So the amazing Dava Sobel, who wrote, Longitude and Galileo's Daughter, is their poetry editor. And by the time I got something to her, she had a long stack, but she said, we'll get to it. Let me know if you have a book coming out. So anyhow, this poem came from one of those, again, the New York Times, but this time a science piece. And it's about mosses that grow in the Mojave Desert. And there was the headline that had been put on it was so extraordinary and so beautiful and so implausible that I knew I was going to do something with it. But it took me something like 6 or 8 months to actually find the poem. And then it took me another 2 months to find an ending for the poem. I sort of had it and I liked it, but I hadn't been able to find an ending. And I think part of that goes to something which has been true of, both of your poems that we've heard, which is the fact, well, facts can precipitate poems. There's lots of relationships we can get into, but the fact alone is not enough to turn it into a poem. There has to be the tension between the image or event or thing we learned, and then you have to do something with it. You have to take it in some unexpected direction. You have to bring in the human issue one way or another. It has to break your heart, whether overtly, the way the ending of Facts About the Moon does, or more subtly and quietly after the poem is over. But what caused me to write this originally was simply something not in the epigraph, but it comes into the first stanza of the poem, and I do attribute it. So, mosses. And the epigraph is, in the Mojave Desert, a translucent crystal offers bryophytes much needed respite from the heat of the sun. New York Times, July 29th, 2020. And if any of you want to go back and find this piece on your computer, it's one of those multi-dimensional pieces that scrolls over gorgeous photographs and is well worth finding. So here's the poem. For hypolithic mosses, it seems, 4% of daylight is right. They live, the headline says, by sheltering under a parasol of translucent quartz. The crystal scatters the light's ultraviolet, dilutes its heat, traps the night's condensed moisture to moss-sized rain. I think of these mosses and consider, perhaps we too are mosses, evolving to the perch of our self-made Mojaves, unable to bear the full brightness, the full seeing, to recognize fully the Amazon burning, the Arctic burning, the monarch's smoke-colored missing migration. An experiment not meant to last. And yet we found shelter within it. We pondered our lives and the lives of others, thirsted, slept. To the implausible green of existence, for better, for worse, we offered our 4% portion of praise. For better, for worse, our 4% portion of comprehension. So, I've been writing a great many of my poems, not all, but a great many for some years now, with the crisis of the biosphere and of climate close to my desk, feeling it acutely, feeling it as a subject that needs to come through me for me to be able to bear what I read and learn and know and foresee and hope to help forestall. The only tool I have for the unbearable, the incomprehensible, what can't be taken in, is to try to meet it in a poem. And so, this is another of a series of poems in which that is the subject. But those mosses that can only live under quartz that lets in 4% of the daylight, how irresistible. So I didn't know when I started to write this that it was going to turn out to be about what it is about. I just started re-saying in my own language and acknowledging the borrowed language what had struck me, for hypolithic mosses, it seems 4% of daylight is right. I mean, that's such a staggering fact. And then putting in the irresistible phrase, they live, the headline says, by sheltering under a parasol of translucent quartz. Parasol. I mean, whoever wrote that, the piece's author or an editor, because you never know who writes a headline to things. It's just absolutely brilliant. And then, you keep going with the facts that were given me by the article, just as your facts about the moon begins by keeping going, just giving, what you heard on that TV program. The crystal scatters the light's ultraviolet, dilutes its heat, traps the night's condensed moisture to moss-sized rain. And then you have to figure out, since this is about the craft of how do facts turn into poems, there's a turn in our poems where the facts do have to begin to find that other subject matter beyond their own skin. And, how that happened for me was simply, by overtly kind of forcing it to happen. I think of these mosses and consider, well, when you write that, you've got to think, what do you think? And so you're tricking yourself as a poet. Whether instinctively and intuitively, and it just feels like it's coming, or whether you're stumped and you're trying to figure out, well, where do I go now? I know I want to go somewhere. I have no idea where it's going to be. So you write this transition. I think of these mosses and consider, well, what do I consider? Perhaps we too are mosses evolving to the parch of our self-made Mojaves. So there it came in, our own creation of a crisis of climate, which is turning half the earth into desert. Our own California, I don't know where other people are listening from, but we started out with such a good winter. We had pouring, drenching, reservoir filling rain, snowpack creating rain, October, November, early December. And then in January, it just stopped. And here we are, back in drought again. And so, that to me is something that's kind of at the heart of this larger subject that we have promised we were going to talk about, of facts into poems, which is, how do you turn a fact into a poem? So Dorianne, how do you turn a fact into a poem? We both have lots of facts in our poems, and of course, there's not only one answer. But I'm tossing this to you now.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that one of the ways I think that we're able to listen to a poem that we really want to turn away from, right? We don't want to hear that the world is dying and that we weren't an adaptive creature, but in fact, we didn't adapt. We haven't adapted. What we've done is create, the situation. The moss didn't create it; it adapted to it. And it's hard to get into a poem, not only for the writer, but I think also for the reader or listener, when they can tell that it's, ooh, wait a minute, this is taking a turn. I might not want, but you grab them with that moss-sized rain, I mean, the poet can't help but be the poet, even when it's concerning facts, just as the whoever generated that title could not resist the parasol, just like you couldn't resist that rain, that moss-sized rain. And then the use of the idea of the implausibility of life to begin with, and for me as a listener, I think, well, okay, yes, we're killing ourselves, we're doing this horrible thing, but we never should have been here to begin with. I mean, it softens the blow a little bit. Just
right, an experiment not meant to last.
I love that it's called an experiment. I mean, we're more used to hearing democracy as an experiment, one that still needs to decide whether or not it's going to succeed or fail. But, to think of life itself as an experiment that we are part of, we are the culture that's being looked at, under the microscope somehow. So you do that, you're able to keep us inside a poem that we really don't want to be inside of because of the poetry. Many of us will put down an article about something because we can't any longer take it in. But poetry, there's something very seductive about the form itself, and the mind of the poet unreeling on the page. But anyway, I love that about your poem, that the poet in you cannot resist the poetry that surrounds this horrific situation. And, I mean, it's of course very similar with Facts About the Moon, these incredible facts that are just beautiful to think about, but there's something that keeps rearing up and saying, well, and somehow I've got to keep myself going. And so language will often do that for me. Image will often do that for, I'm able to get through the horror by looking at some small imagistic beauty or some turn of language that makes it somehow bearable.
Well, I think that's, for me, very often the central reason I'm writing a poem at all is because it brings you back from despair to making that, for better, for worse vow, to commit to the radiance that is found under the sparest and most difficult of circumstances. And poems will always give us that. I've been rereading the Turkish poet Hikmet, and the poems he wrote in prison, where he had nothing. He had a jail cell and a view. And from that jail cell and that view and the love of, who he was sending these poems out as letters to, and receiving letters from, the world was there. And there is, his life was so difficult at every turn. He ended his life in exile. And yet you have never met a poet who declared their love of existence more, that wonderful long poem, Some Things I Didn't Know I Loved.
I love that poem so much. Yes, I mean, and the same with Miguel Hernandez, who they say, Neruda said he was the happiest young boy he had ever met in his life, that he just exuded joy, wherever he went. And while he was a free man, he wrote some of the most biting political poems, and angry, and, but once he was imprisoned and his family was living on onions, and he had tuberculosis and was dying, he wrote the most joyful, loving, poems that he had ever written. I mean, that's how we stay alive.
Right. Poems are always looking at the unattended to side. The thing which isn't the most upfront and center is what a poem will travel to throw a little light into, to bring forward, to compensate, to counterbalance, so that you know, in illness, you remember, you know, the radiance of the days, and in abundance, you're furious at injustice. You rage against stupidity. But facts, we promised people we'd talk about facts. So what do you think about, you know, some poems have them, some poems don't. What are they? That's a kettle of stinging insects.
You know, like I say, you know, facts have always, and I think they tend to draw us, you know, human beings, they love facts. And what's interesting right now is that we're talking about these poems and about the idea of facts during a time when facts are being questioned so much, where people can't agree on the facts, you know, that yes means no, you know, right? You know, what wrong and right are. We used to sort of agree on certain things, you know, how many countries the Nile went through, you know, 11, well, of course, you know, and everybody accepted that as fact. Now, someone will tell you, oh no, it's only one, you know, or oh no, it's, you know, I mean, they will just unceremoniously change the facts to align with whatever it is that they need it to align with. And so I think it's important right now that we do, in a way, you know, bring the idea of the fact into sort of poetic, right, you know, relief, and give them their due when they're being questioned so much, which is what you're saying. I mean, that's what poets do. When there's a void, we abhor a void, you know, and so we have to fill it. And but you know, I've written a number, and especially recently, I wrote a piece called Life on Earth, which is about amazing facts that I had found out that I wanted to put in a poem, you know, and I just started again, you know, just like Facts About the Moon, with the facts. And the facts are, the odds are, just as you were saying, the implausibility of life, you know, the odds are we should never have been born. Not one of us, not 1 in 400 trillion to be exact.
Would you like to read the poem once you're...
I'm reading it. I'm reading
Oh.
it. Yeah. These are just the facts, ma'am. You know, only one among the 250 million released in a flood of semen that glides like a glassine limousine filled with tadpoles of possible people, one of whom may or may not be you, a being made of water and blood, a creature with eyeballs and limbs that end in fists, a you with all your particular perfumes, the chords of your sinewy legs singing as they form, your organs humming and buzzing with new life, moonbeams lighting up your brain's gray coils, the exquisite hills of your face, the human toy your mother longs for, your father yearns to hold, the unmistakable you who will take your first breath, your first step, bang a copper pot with a wooden spoon, trace the lichen growing on a boulder you climb to see the wild expanse of a field, the one whose heart will yield to the yellow forsythia, named after William Forsythe, not the American actor with piercing blue eyes, but the Scottish botanist who discovered the buttery bells on a highland hillside, blooming to beat the band, zigzagging down an unknown Scottish slope. And those are only a few of the things you will one day know, slowly chipping away at your ignorance and doubt, you who were born from ashes and will return to ash. When you think you might be through with this body and soul, look down at an anthill or up at the stars. Remember your gambler chances, the bounty of good luck you were born for. And I just went crazy over this implausibility of life, which you know, speak about in your poem, and how we should all feel so lucky individually and as a species, you know, not only our species, but any species, every species, you know, the implausibility of some cell dividing and making a redwood tree or a human being. You know, it's like, how could you ever, ever, you know, not be amazed?
Yeah. Well, amazement, I think, is another one of the vertebrae of good poems, that, you know, it might not always be as central and spotlit as that amazing. I want a copy of that, please. Right away, as soon as we're off, you're going to email it to me. Yeah. Is it done? Do you
Yeah,
think?
it was published in the Atlantic.
Okay, very good. So you'll send it to me. I'm behind on all my magazines. It's probably sitting in the pile. So amazement, I think one of the things that putting facts into poems does is it allows us to trust the amazement. Let me see if I can tease that thought out a little more. So you were talking before you read the poem little earlier on about, you know, that we live in this moment of alternative facts and how utterly dispiriting that is when any old assertion can be made. And, you know, that any old assertion can be made, that's not a problem. Poems are mostly counterfactuals. You know, poems, most of the time, I have an essay written since the last book called Poetry is a Kind of Lying. And it is, you know, very much about the way poems swerve from the truth in order to say a larger and different truth, you know, that they don't just stay with the literal thing. They're always calling forth something. And, you know, every metaphor is a lie. Every invented, you know, invention is the imagination's facts and not the world's facts. But by pinning the imagination's facts and by pinning our human emotions to these statements that are verifiable, that are shared, it's as if you're building a ladder with solid rungs on it. And it gives the reader and yourself writing the poem a place to stand that allows you to feel this voice, this experience is trustworthy. And because it is trustworthy, I will jump off the top of the 10,000-foot ladder with it and know that it's going to be glorious. But in a world, why I think for, you know, for anyone who's paying attention or cares, and you know, especially perhaps particularly for those of us who care about language and what language's powers are, to see that eroded, erased, disrespected, and much worse, to see that work, to see it effective. Boy, now that is an abyss of, you know, where can we possibly go from here when even the facts are suddenly treated, you know, forgive me, like ash from your cigarette. You know, the world is burned up and scatterable. You can't stand on it, you can't eat it, you can't do anything with it, you can't sleep in it. But I asked a bunch of friends of mine because I got curious, and because I may continue on with this idea we came up with. I may not, but I may. So I asked a bunch of friends, you know, what's your first reaction thought? What is a fact anyhow? And I didn't want it to go down, you know, the epistemological philosophical rabbit hole, which of course the conversation did, because that's what we humans do. But you know, some of the early thoughts about it were, I really loved this one. Somebody said, the smallest unit of truth. And of course, somebody then began to argue about truth, but never mind, that's how we are. And then I love this next one, because I think it is, in fact, what, I wasn't so much interested in what is the, intellectual definition of a fact, but what is the feel of a fact? In a poem, what feels like a fact and allows you to have that oasis moment when you trust that the ladder rung holds, something inarguable, what we don't argue about. That was two other people's responses. Philip K. Dick famously said, and another friend quoted this, "A fact is an aspect of reality, which is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away." That was kind of great. I got a long, wonderful answer from a scientist friend that we don't have time to hear. But it's just fascinating because, of course, fact isn't a word that you much hear in the sciences. You hear the word hypothesis and you hear the word data. You don't hear fact that much. But one of the upshots of what she said that I really loved was she pointed out that science has its data, it has its agreed upon inarguable realities at a 95% statistical rate. And she said the 5% is really important because the 5% is, and this is my addition to it, that's where the humility lives. The 5% is where you acknowledge, I could be wrong, how we see these things might evolve. We haven't reached the endpoint of human understanding. And so I loved that whole conversation hugely and deeply. But, so this idea, I think why we like facts, those of us who do like facts, is because it is a kind of handshake with reality, where we can all step in for a moment to the poem's facts and say, yeah, I trust that, I know that. And then there's some broad landscape that carries on from there of, fact is not exactly nonfiction. There are many poems which are autobiographically true, and yet we wouldn't, when we hear those poems, we don't say that's a fact. We hear a tiny fact somewhere in the autobiographical truth, which of course may or not be the literal truth. It might have been tugged a little here and pleated a little there and had, the seam taken in or let out at some point. But there is, I have noticed for a long time how happy I am when I read a poem that gives me a fact. It just makes me happy. It feels like a piton that's put in a climbing wall. A little solid place to take a handhold as I travel over perilous terrain, looking for something I don't yet know because it's never been seen before, at least not by me. And so, but there is so much, somebody pointed out that in a courtroom, facts are different from the way we use fact in the normal world. They said, so this of course was a lawyer who knows whereof they speak. They said, a jury can find someone guilty even though they are actually innocent, because that jury is directed to only look at a certain kind of fact. And, vice versa. You can easily find someone innocent who is actually guilty, but it couldn't be proved. And so by the courtroom standard of facts, because the evidence could not be found, we say, no, no, we're not going to put that person in jail. That young man from the end of Facts About the Moon, he's going to get to have a life some of the time. And so, what we feel as a fact is contextual, and yet I think we feel them. So I'm going to give you just because you read, which I didn't know you were going to read, Life on Earth, I brought in a couple of poems by other people, and I'm weighing which one. Well, I would love to give you a poem from Life on Mars, Tracy K. Smith's book, because I thought it was interesting. There's a lot of science in it and there's a lot of description in it. And yet the actual facts in it are just two short sentences. Prince Charles married Lady Di, Rock Hudson died. And those are the shared newspaper realities that give you the facts, even though, you know, there's marvelous other factual information given in the poem, like talking about how it took them 2 tries to get the Hubble telescope to see. Anyhow, I recommend to all of you, I'm sure it can be found online in half a second, Tracy K. Smith's poem, My God, It's Full of Stars, and it's the 5th part I'm not reading you. But I'm going to give you, just to bring in another person's voice, a poem by W.S. Merwin that starts not looking like a factual poem and then a fact comes into it. And it just because I love it, and it's a beautiful example of one-way facts can happen in poems. Homecoming. Once only, when the summer was nearly over and my own hair had been white as the day's clouds for more years than I was counting, I stood by the garden at evening. Paula was still weeding around flowers that open after dark, and I looked up to the clear sky and saw the new moon, and at that moment from behind me a band of dark birds, and then another after it, flying in silence, long curving wings hardly moving, the plovers just in from the sea, and the flight clear from Alaska, half their weight gone to get them home, but home now arriving without a sound as it rose to meet them. So half their weight gone to get them home. You know, that's just a fact that William knew. He had it in his knapsack. He knew it because he loved the natural world and he was a student of the natural world. And it's just one line in the poem, but how the poem plunges and deepens with that knowledge slipped into it.
And it's a poetic line.
Yeah.
You know, how does it go again, Jane? Half of their body weight gone to get them
So
home.
the plovers just in from the sea and the flight clear from Alaska, half their weight gone to get them home, but home now arriving.
Half their weight gone to get them home.
Yes.
You know, gone and home, half their weight got, you know, I mean, there's a lot going on that little tiny line.
That's right. The
But
music of it, the music, the meaning, that he thought of it, that he knew it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's part of our amazing
writer might not have written it that way, might have not been attentive to the rhymes of home and gone and, you know, the alliteration. They may have, you know, posed it a different way.
Yeah.
And but a poet immediately finds, I think, the poetry in that fact. I think too that because for us, and for I think many poets, I mean, you've already given us a couple, right, examples, find facts beautiful, and you know, right, we adore them. You know, to see others not find them beautiful and adore them is just very disheartening. You know, yeah.
So we've been talking an hour now. Should we end with one more poem by each of us?
Sure. I have no idea what that would be, but
oh, you're first.
I was just thinking, well, what would I do?
Well, I know. I just pick any one you like.
Well, I'll just do one that is fairly recent, and really is a little bit interesting in the sense that, because I didn't really think of this until now, but I use facts in the poem, but I change them to satisfy myself in a way
Yes.
that needs to be satisfied. So that kind of goes into some of that, facts changing, or that we can change the facts in some ways. That is not a negative, but that could be, in this case, a positive. But it's called Winter Brother. These nights I walk out and look up at Orion, my winter brother, spellbound each time I trace him to wholeness with my eye, from the star on his right shoulder to the star on his left, down to form his torso, lower down his little skirt. I know his right hand holds a club, but I replace it with two splayed arrows pointing up. In his left, a lion's pelt that for me becomes a bow, from hunter to archer, just like that. And why not? Whoever made him up is lost to history's shimmering distance. And I'm here now in my dark backyard, a splash of ghost sibling lilies glowing at my feet. I like to think he's my older brother who died far from home on a lonely road, his broken body found in a muddy gutter, swollen with rain. That's how it is down here on the death-packed earth, where nothing is eternal. The body's buried haunch to haunch beneath the indifferent dirt. I remember his handwriting on a postcard, the lines squashed between the address and the card's cut edge. I miss you. I love you. I saw some sights today you wouldn't believe. On the other side, a wall of etched bricks, a statue of Karl Marx's fat head, his beard of gray stone. When he died, I felt alone. Some part of me went cold, some echo following me like a false star. So I lifted my brother into the sky, where I could ride on his belt as he strode over the 7 continents, sharing an eyedropper of water between us.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you. And so I had, a sort of list of possible fact poems, and I'm going to close with one which is as much about facts as embodying facts. So just to again mix it up a little bit. This is the poem that it's near the end of Ledger, and I wrote it on the 5th day of the last administration, which was the day that the war on facts became extremely clear. It was the day that the White House took down off its website all of the information about climate change that had been up for the preceding 8 years, and also instructed every scientist who was funded by the federal government to not speak about their research until authorized by the political heads of their agencies. And so this struck me, the silencing of the facts of science. It might as well have been an edict saying censor the poets. It was very personal. And by the end of this day, which was January 24th, 2017, I had written this poem. On the 5th day. On the 5th day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or to study the rivers. The scientists who studied the air were told not to speak of the air, and the ones who worked for the farmers were silenced, and the ones who worked for the bees. Someone from deep in the Badlands began posting facts. The facts were told not to speak and were taken away. The facts, surprised to be taken, were silent. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers, and only the wind that spoke of its bees, while the unpausing factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit. The silence spoke loudly of silence, and the river kept speaking of rivers, of boulders and air. Bound to gravity, earless and tongueless, the untested rivers kept speaking. Bus drivers, shelf stockers, code writers, machinists, accountants, lab techs, cellists kept speaking. They spoke the fifth day of silence. So I would like to close by raising a glass to all who feel an allegiance to the factual, and raising a coffee mug to all who extend the factual and make of the stars, as Saint Francis did, sister moon, brother sun, our kin, that the facts are not separate from us, that we are not separate from them. I wish we could talk for another hour, but instead I will just again thank Alaska Quarterly Review for all they bring into the world, including these conversations offered on their YouTube channel. Thank the museum for hosting us with superb technical invisibility. Thank you, Dorianne, for joining me in this. Thank you for writing the poem.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you to Ron Spatz, who's been doing this for a lifetime, it seems.
And holding it aloft when it would seem impossible. The magazine continues to live and lives with the support of everybody who subscribes to it, donates to it, and cares about poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and the marvelous photographs so often included. The visual aspect of AQR is amazing as well.
Yeah, the art.
Okay.
Included. I think Ron wants to come on and say something. There he is. You're muted, dear.
What I want to do is I want to thank the two of you. Profound gratitude for all the years that you have supported us. I mean, it really is quite amazing, and kind of humbled by it. I also want to mention to our audience, there were some problems, not for what people saw, but some people couldn't get on. There was a partial server went down. So there were a lot of people trying to get on at once, and then one of the servers went down, but a lot was on. And I just want everybody to know this was amazing, and tell your friends about it. It is up on YouTube. The recording was not in any way compromised, and it's available along with all of our other events. And so with that, and with thanks to the Anchorage Museum, I think I'll say goodbye for now, but this was humbling and inspiring at the same time experience.